That's just too many shots, Roger. I can't allow it. Federer insisted. I played, what, two shots? One shot I played. Only for Murphy to counter, well, it's one shot too many. I can't allow a challenge in that case. Federer called for the ATP supervisor, but this wasn't just about a missed challenge. His backswing had become shorter over time, his hand dropping into a lower position earlier, keeping the racket head closer to his body. His technique had evolved into something choppier, less fluid, and that evolution, born from persistent back injuries that eroded his confidence, had created a blind spot for officials who'd spent decades reading his old mechanics. The confrontation exposed a raw truth. Federer's changing style didn't just challenge his body, it challenged the very people trying to officiate the game. 3 years earlier, in 1999, that same aggressive technique had painted a very different picture. Young Federer would cry when things went poorly, send his racket skidding across the court after an error, whine at bad calls, slam balls in anger, and argue with his father. I was the opposite of cool, he told Bear Grylls. I was a clever racket thrower. I wouldn't smash it into the ground so I wouldn't have to ask my parents to buy another racket. The court microphones caught everything. You'd hear the sharp crack of his racket hitting the court surface after a missed shot, followed by heated exchanges with chair umpires who were still learning to read his game. Back in the early 2000s, Federer struck his forehand flatter with less topspin through a straighter racket path. From 1998 to 2004, he hit an aggressive backhand with little topspin. Young and free from inhibition, he had the conviction to take the ball early, driving with a high finish above the head. The result was a flat and hard shot, used to finish points quickly. This raw, attacking style created chaos for officials accustomed to reading traditional tennis mechanics. When a player takes the ball that early, that aggressively, the timing of calls becomes razor thin. Line judges would hesitate on close shots because Federer's ball velocity was deceptive. His flatter trajectory meant shots that looked out were actually catching lines. Chair umpires found themselves in impossible positions, making split-second decisions on balls that moved differently than anything they had officiated before. A bleach-blonde teenager stepping inside the baseline, taking balls on the rise with an Eastern grip, driving through shots with minimal topspin. This grip allowed him to hit through the ball and take it on the up, stepping inside the court to dictate play. But when those shots caught lines by millimeters, or when his racket made contact a fraction of a second earlier than officials expected, the arguments would explode. That was good! He'd shout, pointing at a mark that looked ambiguous to everyone else. The officials would shake their heads, sticking to their calls, but you could see the uncertainty in their body language. They weren't questioning the ball's path. They were questioning whether this kid's technique was creating optical illusions they weren't trained to handle. The most heated exchanges came on his serve. When he first came on tour, Federer used the serve and volley tactic much more than he would later, as the courts and balls were generally faster and rewarded such play. He'd charge the net behind serves that officials read as routine, only to find himself in perfect position for putaways. When linesmen called his serves out, Federer would argue not just the call, but the timing, claiming they were making decisions before his racket had even finished its motion. The pattern was becoming clear. His evolving technique wasn't just challenging opponents. It was exposing how unprepared the officiating system was for a player who could manipulate time itself on a tennis court. Those emotional outbursts, the racket abuse, the arguments, weren't just about missed shots. They were about a fundamental disconnect between what his technique was producing and what officials were prepared to see. By 2001, something had to give. Either Federer would learn to control the raw aggression that made his technique so disruptive, or the tennis establishment would need to evolve. Do you think young Federer's aggressive style and emotional outbursts were actually justified given how unprepared officials were for his technique? Or was he just being a hothead? Comment your answer below. But that raw aggression was about to collide with the biggest transformation of his career. By 2015, Federer's backhand had undergone another transformation. Working with his coaching team, he returned to a flatter, more aggressive stroke, spreading both arms behind him, loading power through his right leg. This wasn't a return to his teenage style, it was a refinement. The precision was surgical, and it created a new category of officiating crisis. When a player takes the ball that early, that aggressively, with that much refined control, the margin for error on line calls collapses entirely. Officials who had adapted to reading his mid-career defensive style suddenly found themselves making split-second decisions on balls moving with a level of accuracy their training hadn't prepared them for. The 2019 Wimbledon final against Djokovic became the crucible. Federer's backhand winners came with such precision and such early timing that every close call became a flashpoint. His positioning had become more aggressive, stepping inside the baseline, taking balls on the rise, positioning himself for angles that left officials with microseconds to judge whether the ball had caught the line or missed it by millimeters. When calls went against him, his responses weren't the emotional outbursts of his youth. They were cold, precise challenges backed by the absolute conviction that his technique had reached a level the human eye couldn't reliably judge. The chair umpire's body language told the story. When Federer gestured toward a mark or challenged a call, you could see the hesitation. Not uncertainty about the ball's path, but uncertainty about whether they'd been reading his technique correctly. The psychological warfare had shifted. It was no longer about intimidation or emotion. It was about a player whose technical mastery had exposed the fundamental limits of human officiating. This was the collision the blueprint had promised. A player whose evolved precision didn't just challenge opponents. It challenged the very system designed to judge the game. The confrontations that followed weren't about missed shots or bad luck. They were about the impossible position officials found themselves in when facing a level of technical control that pushed beyond what traditional judgment could handle. By the time that final ended in 5 sets, the message was unmistakable. Federer's technique had become a weapon against the game's own infrastructure. Subscribe for more explosive tennis confrontations. Click the video on your screen right now to watch The Ghost Generation.